What is going on, you beautiful humans? It has been another very long minute since we last saw each other, but I really wanted to follow up with you on a video and really several others that I posted over 2 years ago when it comes to video editing on the MacBook Air lineup as your exclusive piece of hardware. And I want to answer those questions about whether this is really a good idea. And I continue to answer comments on these videos as I really enjoy hanging out with everyone here. And I literally answered a question today. I kid you not. I was filming this video about this particular machine, doing all the tests, but I was already well into it and just really trying to put in some effort to provide you with some updated thoughts as things have. And let's agree here that things have changed since these previous videos were posted. Now, I know that many of you who are interested in picking up a Mac and especially wanting that portability, and I know that your eyes and your wallets are more focused on a MacBook Air because when it comes to just the dollars and cents, it seems to make the most sense on paper. And I often hear terms like future proofing, and I'd actually like to unpack that a little bit more as we go along. But really, let's just start with the fact that since my mini retirement from YouTube, and really, I haven't gone anywhere. I'm just experimenting, creating some other content for another channel and some other platforms. But really, this is my main squeeze right here. So it's still very important to me, and this is why we're hanging out today. But things have changed since the introduction of Apple Intelligence, and whether this has been a smart move that was planned or really just kind of forced, these machines are starting with 16 gigs of unified memory. And it wasn't so much that the 8 gigs was always the bottleneck, but time and time again, I have recommended to all of you out there, this 16 gigs is, and I'll restate this, that it should be the starting point. And I'll share some of the reasons why. I do want to provide some context that when you see many of these videos that we upload here on the platform, and this is just sometimes the case. I am not trying to, let's be clear, I'm not trying to call anybody out on this, but especially like with initial impressions, many of these machines are fresh out of the box and you're often starting with a fairly fresh reboot of these devices. I do not like to restart my devices frequently. And in fact, I did a test where I hadn't even restarted this particular MacBook Air for over a year. And I should do a video on that. And taking that into consideration, I've had this one on for over a week. And honestly, the only reason that happened is because I had to make some OS updates that forced a restart. But typically I have these machines on for several months at a time because they're just so easy to sleep and wake up and just jump right back into what you're doing. But I also feel like that this gives you more of a realistic perspective from someone that runs multiple browsers with hundreds of tabs open. I kid you not. I know it's a sickness. I am working on it. I promise. But I've decided to dust off some old video timelines where the render files have been removed just to show that the MacBook Air had to redo all of this once we exported that project. All of the timelines are 4K footage, XAVC, S, 10-bit, and some other HEVC footage that I have, but just keeping in mind that it's pretty much a mix of H.264 and 265 clips. And I spent some time re-adding some of the LUTs and the grading so that there were notable but very brief spikes with the CPU and GPU, both in the pressure and those temps. The machine did actually recover quite well as I kept scrubbing through the timeline, but there were times that when I was scrubbing, and you'll just notice this, that you'll start to see a delay in the rest of the footage loading in that timeline, but it really didn't really impede my workflow. I just had to pause for a second and then I just kept going. But on the export times, and really this is one of those tests that I don't really think is a great indicator of the capability since these silicon devices are really just that good. But if you wanted to know that I was able to export an 8-minute 4K project, it had multiple camera angles, and I did that in about 4 minutes. It was really no issue. But to reiterate, why I wanted to post this is primarily due to you, because I know that Apple's most recent announcement of the iPhone 16e, there were no MacBook Air updates, and we didn't receive any communication on this thus far. And so this creates continued pressure to wait. So this is actually what I want to talk about as far as the waiting. I will share with you that I was able to do a massive amount of creative work, including paid work on this. Hold on, let me get it. This 2017 MacBook Pro, which does have 16 gigs of RAM, but it has a Core i5 processor in it. And I was able, thankfully, to stop using this when the first Apple Silicon came out, but this provided me with the opportunity to get started. And of course, speaking of starting, I haven't used this thing in years and the fan is still running. So, that being said, many of you are likely just starting out on this journey, which is why we're here, because the MacBook Air is what you keep coming back to. And as much as we, like the creators here, we surround ourselves with the next iteration of these chipsets, this is enough to get you going and carry you for a while. I still use the M2 as it starts to approach its third birthday. And okay, so that argument that I mentioned before, as far as a future proofing, let's put the business hat on here for a second, because I eventually got to a point in my business years later where I didn't need to chase client work to make up for that investment that we were making in hardware and software. So it didn't like add any extra pressure around spending. But I will tell you what, when you are just starting out, it can be suffocating when you're rationalizing this type of hardware, needing all of these upgrades, all of these like additions to get started, and then you find yourself scrambling for revenue just to cover those costs when you could have just started with something like this and you're already well on your way to getting things done. But from a consumer perspective, because that's where we are, when you look at either the M2 or M3 MacBook Air, and then of course the base model 14-inch MacBook Pro, that seems to be catching your eye. You really need to ask yourself whether that extra $500 to $600 difference between those MacBook Airs and the MacBook Pros, if that is really the way to go, because you could use that extra cash for an external SSD, which I do always recommend regardless, because even though I have 1 terabyte internal on like inside of this, I still use external drives. Some of you are students out there, many of you in my comments section. So like you're saving for school or other expenses, but you still want something like this to create and get other work done. And this is where your budget is. So I would recommend sticking to that budget. I know that some of you out there have the ability to find refurbished deals on the M3s. I've talked to a couple of you out there that you've been able to find some with a couple of like upgrades, a little bit extra, that are still falling in line with the new retail price for that base model. And for those refurbished base machines from Apple, especially the ones that are from Apple, they're coming with 16 gigs of memory. So this isn't about clearing out old stock that still has that 8 gig to start. But for some of you, I know that in certain countries that it could be the case. But hopefully you're able to get your hands on a refurbished option with the 16. And of course, before you're ready to finally make that buying decision, I am not trying to throw you a curveball here. I'm like, my shoulder's actually tweaked. It's a little under the weather. But I did do a multicam test, like this timeline, that we are not just talking about a typical 2 and maybe occasionally 3 clips that you're adding to cut between A-roll and B-roll. I keep this 4cam library around to stress test many of these machines that I've had. And I will say that this is a timeline that will have this particular machine asking you, so what do you want me to do with this? Yes, the CPU did spike and sustained higher temps, so did the GPU. The memory was pretty much under pressure consistently, to the point where scrubbing through the timeline, I mean, it even just playing through it caused a bunch of dropped frames. This is actually what it was like when I was using that 2017 MacBook Pro, and I really don't want that for you, for anybody. But as I said, you're probably not here if this is a starting point for you as far as what you are doing creatively. And you'll see that in a sustained demand on the CPU and GPU, that this is where the absence of a fan is noticed. But this is also where you can see that the swap memory is definitely being utilized as the app requires more. As you move along in your workflow, you're adding more and more. And regardless of the timeline, this just happens. And aside from that knee buckling timeline that I showed you, yours and typically most of mine will be just fine. And I haven't had any problems with any force quitting or complete hangups with my non 4cam projects. But Final Cut Pro, when we talk about efficiency, Final Cut Pro and Resolve are extremely efficient on these machines and have continued, at least for me, to get better with the updates. And I just continue to come back to Final Cut because it just really meets all of my needs, really at this stage of my career. And honestly, I just like what I like. So let me just wrap this up, because my final thoughts here are, I hope that you are picking up what I am seriously like delivering, what I am laying down. Apple, yes, at some point in the future, will be upgrading these machines. And when they do, please consider that you have made a valuable investment in either the M2 or M3 MacBook Air, because you are now on your way to building whatever future you want for yourself instead of waiting for it to come to you. Either of these machines will get you well into your journey. And if that extra $100 US doesn't make much of a difference for you, then I would say, go for it from the M2 to M3. But also understand that the M2 that I tested here today, like I continue to use this, I will still continue to use this, and it can be a great tool for you. Save money where you can and reinvest that back into you, and really just get to making something and continuing to build and iterate on that. As I always say, I appreciate your time here. You go out there and rock those faces, and I will be back. So I'll catch you right back here on the next one. Let's actually look and see if there's anything on Mac Rumors or Apple Insider. Just refresh that page real quick. No announcements from Apple. You're still good.